Greetings. I am Ted Morrissey, and I'm here to read one of my stories, short stories, Communion with the Dead. I'll give you just a little bit of background on that for anyone who may be interested. A little bit of forewarning here. I've got a couple of dogs who seem to get freaked out by my talking to my computer, so very likely they'll start going a little crazy here in a few minutes, so I'll have to pause, deal with that, and so forth, particularly if the UPS driver shows up. We don't want to be here for that. But anyway, in the meantime, as I said, I'm going to read this story called Communion with the Dead. It was published in the Chariton Review in actually 2008, so it is an older story. I chose this from among my older stories for probably a couple of reasons. One is that as I look back, it sort of marks kind of a break in my writing style, my interests as an author, and so it sort of is a harbinger of things to come. And then also, as I look back on it, I see that it has actually several similarities to a series of stories, episodes, pieces that I've written, which are going to be published soon as a book with the title Crowsong for the Stricken. Again, some of the same elements that are in that book I see in this story, which even though it was published in 2008, I know it was written quite a while before that, although I don't recall exactly how long. When it first started, when I first wrote it and started sending it around, it had a little bit more highfalutin title. It was called Nequia, a Greek term, which I'm sure I'm probably mispronouncing. But a Nequia or Nequia is when characters visit the dead. For example, in Book 11 of Homer's Odyssey, when Odysseus has to go to the underworld to find the prophet Tiresias and hopefully get some information about how to find his way home. That is called Nequia because of his visitation to the dead. And so anyway, when I first started sending this story around, that's what I called it. It didn't get picked up, but at the same time, I wasn't super aggressive about getting it out there in the world. And then I kind of got out of the habit of sending my work around for a while. I had started working on my doctorate in English at Illinois State University, and besides that, and teaching, and a couple other jobs thrown in there, and a family, etc. One of the things that kind of fell by the wayside wasn't so much my writing as it was my efforts to get my writing published. But a little bit later, I got serious about that again. And when I started sending the story around, I changed the title to simply what Nequia means, which is basically communion with the dead. And so that's the title under which it was published in 2008. Like I said, it appeared in the Chariton Review. I was very pleased about that acceptance because the editor of the Chariton Review at the time was Jim Barnes, who was already legendary as a writer, poet, editor. And so I felt very good about his selecting my story. It hasn't been collected anywhere. I have uploaded it to my Wattpad site, if you know what Wattpad is. And it does happen to be, of the older stories that I've uploaded to Wattpad, to be the one that has garnered the most reads. I have a couple of full-length works on Wattpad, Weeping with an Ancient God and Men of Winter, that have been featured by the Wattpad people who do such stuff. And they've received thousands of reads, which I'm very appreciative of, particularly the people who might like or comment on the pieces. But of all the just plain short stories that I've put on Wattpad, Communion with the Dead has certainly gotten the most reads. I'll in the description for this video, I'll put links to how you might be able to track it down more easily, as if you couldn't just Google Ted Morrissey, Communion with the Dead, and it would be found, immediately. But I'll put some links there just in case. And so meanwhile, I'll read this story. Not a whole lot of gloss is needed here. It is set in Italy. Therefore, there are some Italian names, which I'll do my best to pronounce without embarrassing myself too much. But give me some leeway there. And it's an earlier time period, probably the 1950s, that kind of thing. And I think that's about it. There's a bit of music that is featured in the story, an opera called Le Maschieri. And one time when I read the story live, a friend of mine was on another laptop, or a laptop, and played bits and pieces of the opera at certain points, and that was kind of cool. It could have been probably a bit more rehearsed, but that's okay. But unfortunately, that's not quite something I can work into this reading of the story. Nevertheless, hopefully you'll enjoy it. And as I said, this is Communion with the Dead, published in 2008 in the Chariton Review. And here I go. Paulo overheard the news that father was ill, very ill, likely dying, while he was cleaning the dinner dishes, and it penetrated him thoroughly, like the way a Christmas sunrise can, or a direct look from a pretty girl, so that even his deepest marrow registered it. Mrs. Stevedore brought the news and a blackberry cobbler. She told of father's condition, while Paulo's mother arranged the ground coffee in the pot and increased the fire in the stove. The smell of the virgin coffee and father's illness became paired then in Paulo's recollection forever, he knew. The baying of a dog and All Saints preparations, numbing cold in the toes and fingers, and... Paulo absently finished the dishes, then went out and poured the dirty water on the garden plot in the yard. His mother was convinced the wash water would help to fertilize the earth. Paulo doubted that such meager bits would do anything, except attract cats to their yard to noisily fight and make love in the dead of night. He often lay sleeplessly in bed listening to their feral communion. Paulo put away the dishes, almost dropping a saucer, his young fingers clumsy still, and smelled the coffee beginning to brew. He told his mother he was going out. She surfaced from her conversation with Mrs. Stevedore long enough to tell Paulo not to be too late, her usual farewell. Mrs. Stevedore and Paulo's mother had been neighbors for many years, but only friends since his mother joined Mrs. Stevedore in widowhood. Their dead husbands connected the two women indissolubly. Paulo did not understand the kinship, but was glad his mother had someone to talk to besides him. The village streets were quiet, save for the wind in the trees and leaves raining down like paper bats that have lost their gift of flight. Paulo had not taken a jacket, so as he walked he buttoned his sweater as far as he could and hoped it would be enough. The moon was low and only a quarter waxed. Uncle Felix, the elders called such a moon. Take your sweetheart for a stroll with Uncle Felix, the saying went, and she will love you like no other. A paper bat struck Paulo on the shoulder before wheeling to the ground. It stirred Paulo's senses, and he realized he was near Angela's house. Paulo stopped in Uncle Felix's weak glow and studied Angela's. There was only light from a back room, the kitchen presumably, and it spilled lemony onto the side yard and hedge. The rest of the girl's house, upstairs too, was dark. For a moment Paulo thought he heard people talking inside, then realized it was the record player, Mascagni, La Maschieri. They are lying beneath the hedge on their stomachs. The opera is playing. The handkerchief lies on the ground between them, is covered in the red berries that grow on the hedge. Her eyes are as brown as her legs that show beneath the plain white skirt, raised unusually high when they scooted under the poking branches, feet first. He is in disbelief at what she has told him, that her parents have arranged a marriage to a boy whose father owns an olive business. The boy's name is the same as his. Is that not funny? The olive business will be the son's one day. He is in disbelief. Still, he cannot help but sneak looks at the back of her thighs. He puts a berry in his mouth and lets it lie beneath his tongue before she makes him spit the inedible berry to the ground. Even without chewing it, has a bitter taste. There was someone coming along the street. Paulo did not want to meet anyone, so he backed into Mr. D'Angelo's dark yard and stood next to the black trunk of Mr. D'Angelo's apple tree. The fruit was almost lemon yellow and delicious, he recalled. Paulo felt the knots of rotten apples beneath the soles of his shoes. None of Uncle Felix's light reached him. He was completely invisible, as corporeal as a shadow. Paulo could tell by the walker's gait it was Angela, her stride long and light, still girlish. He used to worry that Angela's accident, the whole village called it her accident, would alter her girlishness, but these many months had passed and Angela's movement was the same as before, just nothing else. She came into view in Uncle Felix's semi-light, and she was carrying something on her arm, a wicker basket. No doubt she had taken food to Father's, a loaf of bread or a shepherd's pie. Angela was in her long crocheted cloak, its hood up. Only her bare calves and sandals showed beneath the dyed wool. It was not so chill out tonight, not yet, but Paulo thought that Angela overdressed since her accident. Maybe the extra clothing made her feel protected, like a locust's outer skeleton, or maybe she felt hidden by the clothes, away from everyone's prying, sympathetic eyes. Paulo wanted to speak to Angela, but he hesitated, not wanting to startle her, and she slipped silently through her side yard, past the hedge, and Paulo heard the back door shut. He stood for a time under Mr. D'Angelo's apple tree, watching Angela's empty yard and listening to impulsive Mascagni. The music seemed sadder than Paulo remembered. He stirred himself and continued down the street toward Father's, a way he had traveled so many times before. Everyone in the village had. Strange that tonight it was so deserted. Just he and Angela and Uncle Felix and the leaves falling like paper bats. Paulo turned the final corner, and even at this distance could tell there were people in Father's yard, some standing while others sat on Father's stone benches. There was a bird bath to match, and a worn stepping stone that had not been used for its true purpose in years. Paulo could not see these details in the barely moonlit yard. He simply knew them, the way a child knows his mother's hand and the curve of her lap and breast. The thought of meeting the watchers in Father's yard, the butcher and the baker and the tailor, so to speak, seemed too much for Paulo. He did not wish to talk to them, to be respectful, could not say why he had come. The truth was he did not know why. Before the watchers noticed him, Paulo angled into Mrs. Romero's yard, through the space in the fence where a board had been missing since before Paulo was born, and expertly took the serpentine route to the back of Father's house, avoiding the broken stone in Mr. Villani's walk and lifting Mr. Spagiano's gate latch up and a hair to the left, so that it swung as silently as a lamb's tail. Finally, Paulo was at the wall surrounding Father's garden. He found the stones that protruded slightly for hand and footholds, and began the modest ascent. The stones were strange, shallower and closer together than Paulo realized it was he. It had been some time since he had entered Father's garden in this way, and he had grown. His hands and feet were larger, his legs longer. The stones were smooth and cold, like reptilian skin. He was at the top of the wall, perching there for a moment, as a cat might. Uncle Felix gave the stones a bluish cast. Paulo confidently reached down with his long leg to find the stone that allowed you to cut the distance or the descent in half and drop gently to the ground. He shifted his weight but somehow missed the stone entirely and fell, hitting the ground hard, jarring himself, even losing his wind for a time. But he quickly discovered he was all right and got himself up. He was standing in lush grass, and just in front of him was the stone path that wound through the flower beds and shrubs and old trees. Even in its autumnal dormancy, Paulo could tell the garden had grown a little wild. Perhaps Father had become too weak to tend it and had no boys to help him. The out-of-control garden made Paulo think of the long poem by the blind Englishman that they had read in school winter term. In the shadows and Uncle's cerulean light, it was easy to imagine demons and seraphs lurking. Paulo advanced along the stone path until he could clearly see Father's second-floor bedroom window, where a faint light, a candlelight perhaps, or the light of extreme unction, illuminated the white sheer, giving it a ghostly appearance. Paulo stopped near the statue of Jerome Emiliani and put his hand on the saint's cold shoulder. He always liked Jerome Emiliani's placid alabaster features as the saint appeared to watch over Father's house, and Paulo wished he could see them now in the darkened yard. He thought of Angela, and La Mascari continued to play in his head, and he thought of another night at Angela's, when Angela's father would not allow Paulo to see her. Paulo strained to hear what was happening beyond the closed bedroom door. There should be sound, sobbing at least, the dulcet voice of Dr. Verdi, but there was nothing. Silence, silence heavier than sobs. A fluttering in the black tree behind him made Paulo think of demons and seraphs again. He gripped Jerome Emiliani's stone shoulder more tightly, and he stood there for some time looking at Father's diaphanous window, not thinking for a change, just being. The scent of something wild and oversweet drifted in the black garden. Though almost unpleasant, Paulo breathed it in greedily until his head nearly ached. "You are here to wish Father well?" The voice came from the dark shrubbery. Paulo was startled, but more embarrassed to be found there, of being observed without knowing it. "Father appreciates your visit, I am certain." Paulo peered over his shoulder into the garden, but could discern only a dark shape, part of it human maybe, another part hedge or hanging vines. I am Paulo. I was on the altar with Father." His voice faltered a bit with his quickened heartbeat. "Yes, I know you, Paulo. How have you been, you and your mother?" "My mother is fine, thank you." Paulo seemed to know to whom the voice belonged. Paulo rather wanted to know to whom the voice belonged. The man had to realize he was nearly invisible in the dark yard. The voice was inconsistent, at first something older, then younger, then— "And you, how have you been, my boy?" The voice would not let Paulo off. Paulo stared at the darkness again, his hand still clinging to the statue. There was something about the voice that would not allow Paulo to lie, yet he did not care to confess the truth, that he often felt miserable and lonely, and other things to which he could not attach a name. Paulo stood dumb in the black garden, his knuckles turning white, gripping Jerome Emiliani's white shoulder. The moment was interrupted when the rear door of Father's house was unlatched and opened slowly. Paulo stepped into the dark shrubbery, not opposite the voice exactly, but not close either. In Uncle's blue light, Paulo watched the baker, Mr. Rabatini, come onto the stone patio, then roll and light a cigarette. The match's brief flare showed Mr. Rabatini's bulbous nose and round cheeks, his features seeming puffed up by his yeast. The baker stepped to the edge of the patio and appeared to look directly at Jerome Emiliani, then at Paulo, but Paulo knew he was indiscernible. He waited, wondering if the voices would speak He waited, wondering if the voice would speak to Mr. Rabatini. Paulo's imagination began to get the better of him. He suspected the garden was filled with strange visitors, all standing silently in the blackness, some watching the baker, others Paulo. He believed he heard their breathing, even felt the hairs on their hands as they brushed against his fingers, so close were they to him. Mr. Rabatini's cigarette must have been half smoked when Paulo could wait no longer, and he ran to the garden wall. Mr. Rabatini, startled, called out, "Whoa, what? Who's there?" Paulo went directly to the usual place, but could not locate the familiar stone. Instead, there was a rough patch where the protruding stone had been chiseled off. He did not panic, however. There was fear in the baker's voice. He did not care to investigate. He just wanted the intruder to leave. Paulo's fingers and toes discovered alternate niches, and he deftly pulled his young body to the top of the wall, where Mr. Rabatini must have seen the figure of him for an instant in the blue light before Paulo vanished. Paulo hurried from Father's yard, not running, though. He chose shortcuts by which he could avoid Father's street altogether. He doubted the baker would report the disturbance to the other watchers, but Paulo did not want to risk being seen. The exertion had caused him to break a sweat, and now the breeze felt cold on his skin. Paulo shivered. He came again to Angela's house and again paused. He listened closely for the record player. The wind had risen. So perhaps he heard the music, or perhaps the opera was only in his mind. He thought of another evening at Angela's. Angela's grandfather had drunk too much wine at dinner and was becoming boisterous. There were dots of tomato sauce in his white mustache. He told a story about stealing apples when he was a boy. When the old man began, the story was supposed to have a moral, but when he mentioned that his brother was his co-conspirator, it reminded him that his brother died in the war, of dysentery, for the love of God, and the old man lost his train of thought and did not finish the apple-stealing story. Suddenly the grandfather was aware of Mascagni playing, and he hummed along, filled with melancholy at first, then snapping back to his boisterousness. I was there the night the great Pietro opened La Maschera at Verona, January 1901. It had been raining, a cold rain all day. Then God said, "Let there be moonlight for Mascagni on opening night." I was with the other peons in the back, of course, but the music. The old man gripped his chest and hummed again with the record, or with the tune in his brain. Do you know what the fools did? I will tell you. They hissed Pietro's opera, like a pack of asinine cats. Hissed! The grandfather was indignant still, half a century later. I could not believe what was happening. Shut up, I said to the filthy cats near me. Shut up! Stop hissing the great one's music, you fools! That is precisely what I said to them. The old man was quiet for a moment, self-satisfied. Now, pish, they all love Mascagni, the genius of La Maschera. The filthy cats probably have Pietro's record in their dens, next to a framed handbill from opening night, which they had to purchase from a collect because they tore theirs up and trampled it under their filthy paws. Angela's grandfather, his cheeks crimson, finished off his glass of wine, then sat staring at his stomach, sullen. Paolo recalled that he died a few weeks later of a stroke. It was before Angela's accident. God granted the old man that, and moonlight on Pietro's opening night. With the stronger wind, leaves rained down vigorously, swept across the street one way, then swirled and went back again, as if uncertain of their path. Paolo heard them more than saw them, felt them hit his back, shoulder, head, swirling around his legs like an incoming tide. When his father was alive, they went to the coast once or twice a year, camping on the beach, just like vagabonds, his mother would say, but she loved it. Paolo was opening his front gate when he noticed the glow of a cigarette. He thought of his father, who would smoke after supper, pacing slowly about the yard, observing the moon and the heavens if the weather was good. "Hello?" said Paolo, nearly adding "father," for it seemed almost possible tonight. The visitor tossed away the cigarette. "Paolo," said Angela, "I have been waiting. I need to talk with you." Paolo, in disbelief, came into the yard. The figure in the dark was the right height, and it was Angela's voice. Yet he imagined her an older version of herself, the timing of everyone's life out of sync. He realized he had felt this way for some time, but had not been able to articulate it. Perhaps he was now an older version of himself, too. He wondered briefly if it was possible to go back. "Yes," said Paolo. "Let us walk." Angela came forward and took his hand and led him from the yard. Paolo glanced at his companion, wanting to see her face, but her hood was up, and in the dark he saw no features. He had the mad notion that this was not Angela at all, but a stranger staging a malignant prank, or even some otherworld demon toying with his soul. "Paolo, you are my oldest friend, and I need your help," said the shadow posing as Angela. Anger boiled up in Paolo's gut. "What of your promised one? Why not go to him?" Paolo's venom surprised even himself. He felt hot in spite of the fresh wind. Angela let go of Paolo's hand, perhaps repulsed suddenly by his reptilian touch, yet continued to walk with him. "I cannot. He has released himself from the promise. I cannot blame him," she said. Paolo did not understand immediately, then said, "The accident." Angela's voice was now rife with poison. "It was no accident. Why does everyone call it such? Those filthy animals knew precisely what they were doing." The wind blew back Angela's hood, and her long hair danced in the breeze, but her face was still a mystery. "I will stop using the word." Paolo reached for her hand, and Angela accepted his. They continued to walk and were quiet for a moment in the quiet night, quiet save for the wind and swirling leaves. Then Angela said, "I must see Father before he dies. I must be forgiven." "You know he cannot do that any longer." More strange emotions stirred in Paulo. He stopped in the dark street and fell to his knees, overcome by them. Angela stroked his hair. "Tell me," she said gently. The alien feelings choked Paulo's voice at first. "I miss Father. I miss being with him. They want me to hate him but forgive him. But in truth, I do not hate him at all. I do not hate Father at all." "I know." Angela knelt with Paulo and enfolded him in her crocheted cloak. "I know." Paulo breathed in Angela. She was soap and smoke and time. For once he loved her without the desire to possess her. His tears dampened the blouse of her dress. He felt the bones of her body and her flesh. She was thin, nearly skeletal, but of this world after all. In a moment he helped her to stand and said, "Let us see Father. It surely is not too late." The idea of seeing Father again, really seeing him, both thrilled and terrified Paulo. They had been making their way to him all along. Hand in hand they took the final turns, nearly running headlong into a group coming from Father's house. "Children," said Mr. Rabatini, the baker, his voice startled again. "What are you doing out?" "We must see Father," said Paulo, giving himself away. Until then, Angela and he were only anonymous adolescents in the dark street. "Father passed on this evening. Monsignor is at the house, but he is very tired. Speak with him in the morning if you must." Mr. Rabatini lit a match, shielding the flame with his puffy hand to confirm his suspicions. Angela and Paulo, "Go home now. It is late." The others with the baker said nothing. Paulo and Angela were outcasts of tragedy in the village. "Yes, we will," agreed Paulo, leading Angela away. Angela began to speak, but Paulo cut her off. "Wait." When they were away from Mr. Rabatini and his group, Paulo ducked in between houses and found the familiar route. Soon they were at the wall surrounding Father's garden. "What are we doing?" asked Angela. "I'm not sure." Paulo found the old stones just as Uncle Felix peeked from behind clouds and shed his blue light upon them. "Here," he encouraged Angela to scale the wall. He followed her and had her wait a moment at the top. Paulo found a way down and helped Angela to the ground. They took hands again, and Paulo looked for Jerome Emiliani, who glowed ethereally in the garden. They approached the saint. Paulo noticed that Father's bedroom window was black. It is a terrible thing for a boy to lose his father, especially so young, to see him killed at that. He remembers the numbing cold, his fingers and toes of stone. They are alone in his room, a silver crucifix upon the wall, the scent of beeswax in the air. It is all right to cry, no shame in it at all. You come to see me any time, day or night. You have always been special to me, like a son. His touch is warm, his fingers smell clean, just washed in holy water. He imagines his breath smells of the body and the blood. He pulls down the shear. Angela stood behind the statue and Paulo behind her. He noted that he was nearly a head taller now. The three of them, Jerome Emiliani, Angela, and Paulo, were like graduated stepping stones in line. Paulo stared at Father's black window and waited for the voice from the garden. Angela's hair whipped against his neck and face, the stone wall and the garden itself unable to hold back the wind. Who knew what she was thinking? But Angela was patient. The wind in Paulo's ears seemed to carry words, or to be words themselves. Paulo, without thinking, repeated them. "Confess your sins, Angela. He shall hear you." She hesitated, but only for a moment. "I confess to Almighty God, to Blessed Mary, ever Virgin, to Blessed Michael the Archangel, to Blessed John the Baptist, to the holy apostles Peter and Paul, and to all the angels and saints. I have sinned in thought, word, and deed." She struck her bird-like breast 3 times. "Say." "I had life within me, within my womb, but I had it taken out of me, as if a diseased thing. Angela's voice faltered. Her cloak, still open from enfolding Paulo, blew in the wind like great wings tethered to the ground. They flapped against Paulo's legs, then the base of Jerome Emiliani. May Almighty God be merciful upon you and forgive you. Amen, cried Angela, as she steadied herself on the saint's shoulders of stone. May the merciful one grant us pardon, absolution, and remission of our sins. Amen, she wept again. Take away from us, Lord, we beseech you. Who is there? Paulo could not place this voice at first. Then he looked to Father's window and saw a dark shape beyond the casement. Who is in the garden? Angela turned around to Paulo, and he smelled the salt tears in her breath. Go, he said. It is done. She ran from him, her cloak caught on the saint's statue. In her fear, she let it drop from her shoulders. Her white dress and white arms and legs glowed in Uncle Felix's light. She stopped and looked for Paulo. Angela seemed to hang suspended in the wind, night mist floating close to the earth, waiting for dawn in order to disappear completely. Paulo waved to her, and she, perhaps comprehending or perhaps not, scampered up the wall, glancing back to him for a moment before dropping to the other side. Paulo untangled Angela's cloak and stood waiting, resolute to be discovered, as placid and as stone cold as the saint. Thanks.